With the recent success of the first Spider-Man movie, Columbia Pictures were quick to begin working on a sequel, which they hoped to have in theaters as early as 2004. Now, after previously rejecting a version written by David Koepp, they would hire the author, Michael Chabon, to pen a new script. So, what if Michael Chabon's version of the movie was made? In September of 2002, Columbia Pictures would hire Michael Chabon to pen a new script for Spider-Man 2. Chabon, by this point, had experience working on Marvel projects, as he had previously written unmade screenplays based on both the X-Men and the Fantastic Four. So now this version starts off with Peter nearly getting fired from the Daily Bugle, and then we see him actually getting fired from his job as a pizza delivery man before he returns to he and Harry Osborn's shared apartment. We discover that Harry has become extremely paranoid about Spider-Man coming to kill him, so he's installed a retinal scan system and posted a bodyguard at his front door. On top of this, Harry is clearly starting to lose his mind a little bit. He'll switch from happy best friend to why won't you help me find Spider-Man within the same conversation. He also has a noticeable hatred for Mary Jane and badmouths her every chance he gets. Either way, Harry and Peter go to see Dr. Otto Octavius, who works in arachnid biometrics, and in this version is actually a young man in his early 20s. We witness, as you can probably expect, an experiment gone wrong, but seemingly not as wrong as we'd think. Spider-Man is able to shut down his machine before it does too much damage, and Otto is still able to detach his 4 mechanical arms. Peter then meets Octavius, but before he can ask him any questions, he hurries off to MJ's play, which in this version he's already seen twice, though he hasn't actually seen her yet, as MJ is actually the understudy, and tonight is her big debut. However, he shows up late, and the usher refuses to let him inside until the intermission. However, while he's waiting, he hears police sirens, and of course, he misses his chance to see the play. We then see Peter and his Aunt May get into a slight argument with each other, because May wants Peter to let his emotions out and just grieve for Uncle Ben, instead of pretending that nothing's wrong. That's when Peter tells the truth about what happened the night that Uncle Ben died, and she gets pissed off, and she shouts at him to leave her house. His luck only worsens from there, though, because then he learns that Harry has actually put out a $10 million bounty on Spider-Man. Peter then decides it's time to move out, and he gets his own apartment. We now see that Otto is extremely interested in Spider-Man and has tape recorded dozens of news reports about him. He also witnesses an interview with Mary Jane on TV, and we see him become immediately infatuated with her. Now, meanwhile, people all over the city, including children, have now turned on Spider-Man and attack him fairly regularly. Now, Otto actually approaches Mary Jane, and the two start dating each other. That's when Peter goes to MJ's house, hoping to apologize to her, but he decides to leave because he sees her there with Otto. Now, Peter feels like being Spider-Man has kind of ruined his life, so he steals an experimental parody chip from Otto, which, theoretically anyway, could take away his powers. However, the chip is seemingly a dud, and a frustrated Peter sets his costume on fire in a garbage can. Now, later on that day, his powers actually do start to go away, and Peter is thrilled about it. He asks out Mary Jane, but she shuts him down because she's going out with Otto now. But their date goes badly when it turns out that the experiment has made him a bit crazy, and he sprouts 4 mechanical arms from his back. Peter, who had been creepily watching their date from afar, goes after him in a makeshift Spider-Man suit, and we get a fight between them on top of a moving train. Otto, now Doc Ock, escapes, leaving Peter to stop the now out-of-control train. Meanwhile, Otto returns to his lab in extreme pain, now that the arms have actually infected his body and are killing him now. Now, a group of surgeons try to help him, only to be killed when they attempt to operate. Otto then tries to cure himself, only to find that the parity chip is now missing. He therefore concludes that Peter must have taken it and given it to his quote-unquote friend, Spider-Man. MJ then gets fired from her play, and she goes to Peter's apartment for comfort, realizing that he's the only one that's ever understood her. So they go out together, and Peter tries to convince her that he's changed, and they can be together now. But she just doesn't believe him. He then tries to get his job back at the pizzeria, but is denied by Mr. Aziz. However, a robber wearing a Spider-Man mask shows up, and Peter gets simply knocked to the ground, a clear indication that he's no longer Spider-Man in any way. We then see Harry being threatened by Doc Ock to help supply him with materials for a new experiment, and offers to kill Spider-Man for him since he needs his body to cure himself. Now, Harry is unsure at first, but he changes his mind after visiting his father's grave. Doc Ock then begins terrorizing the city and claims that the chaos won't stop until Spider-Man comes out of hiding. Peter, meanwhile, is very depressingly watching the news, knowing that there's nothing that he can do about it. But that's when Aunt May comes to apologize for kicking him out, and she gives him the pep talk that he needs to at least try and stop Doc Ock. We then see Otto deciding to use Mary Jane in order to lure out Spider-Man. Peter chases after them, but is ultimately defeated by Otto, who tells him to find Spider-Man or else. Now, after Otto leaves, Peter uses nearby pliers to dig the parity chip out of his body, regaining his powers in the process. However, in their big fight at Rockefeller Center, he ends up being defeated and captured. We cut to Doc Ock's lab, where he has Mary Jane hostage and Spider-Man strapped to an operating table. He calls in Harry, and they all learn that Peter is Spider-Man. Harry is overwhelmed by his conflicting emotions, and he leaves there in a hurry. MJ, meanwhile, is able to convince Otto not to kill Peter, and he ultimately kills himself instead. Peter then confesses his love for Mary Jane, and they kiss. Harry then discovers his father's Green Goblin equipment, and the movie ends with the final swing. However, Chabon's version was ultimately rejected. Director Sam Raimi believed that Doc Ock needed to be older than Peter, believing that his story worked better with a student-mentor dynamic. Chabon would be replaced in the end by Alvin Sargent. However, Chabon, along with his predecessors, would all receive credits on the final film, which released in 2004 to massive critical acclaim. So what do I think of Michael Chabon's Spider-Man 2? Okay, so I liked his Fantastic Four quite a bit. I liked what he was going to do with that. And this one, okay, this one is interesting because a lot of what he put into his version made it into the final movie, like Doc Ock being the main villain, the final sequence where he's got Mary Jane kidnapped, and his, alliance with Harry Osborn, all that made it in. And, there's Peter not wanting to be Spider-Man anymore, but, I don't think any of it is done as well in this version. No disrespect to Chabon, because I know he's a great author, and as I said, I really liked his Fantastic Four script, but I really don't like this one very much, I'm sorry. Because first of all, I think a lot of people act out of character in this version. Peter is desperate to stop being Spider-Man in this movie. He is actually, as I said, he gets mad when his powers don't go away immediately. He actually burns his costume, in a garbage can on fire, and I can't imagine Peter doing that. When Peter did it in the actual movie, he was reluctant to do it. He didn't know if it was the right thing to do. He had that, inner conversation with Uncle Ben about whether it was the right thing to do. And, he's so eager to get rid of it in this version, and I don't like it, honestly. I think it makes him seem like, it doesn't feel like Spider-Man to me. Peter in the comics and in the movies, he has to put up with a lot of shit, okay? Spider-Man is a real shit taker. He has to just get the worst luck in the world all the time, but what makes him so special is that he keeps persevering. He never loses his desire to do good, you know what I mean? He always wants to do the right thing, no matter what. And to see him in this version so eager to leave it all behind, so eager to just quit, man, I don't like that at all. I'm sorry. It doesn't feel like Spider-Man to me. It really doesn't. And I'm sure that I'm in the minority. I'm sure there's plenty of people that are going to disagree and say, what do I know? But for me personally, I don't like how Peter acts in this version at all. And then there's Harry Osborn, who I just found to be overly douchey in this version. Like, he had a right, I guess, to be mad because, yeah, he thought that Peter was withholding his revenge. But, like, in this version, not only does he hate Peter, well, it's so weird. He, like, hates Peter, but he doesn't. Like, I'm not kidding you. In the same sentence, he'll be like, oh, how are you? How's everything? Great? Oh, okay, now are you going to tell me about Spider-Man? Like, he'll be like that. Like, he'll start yelling at him in the same sentence he was being calm. Like, and it almost makes me feel like he's literally going insane. And, you know, that's not even getting, you know, to the fact that there are subplots in this movie that don't go anywhere. Like, Harry Osborn starts seeing a therapist that he makes a point of saying is female, and then nothing ever comes of it. Like, he goes to one therapy appointment that we see in the script, but then nothing ever comes of it. The therapist is never brought up again. And it just makes me wonder why they even bothered including that in the first place. You know what I mean? It just doesn't make any sense. And don't even get me started on Aunt May. Like, Aunt May reacts so out of character, in my opinion, to Peter's revelation. Like, I love the fact that in the movie, she's a little upset. Like, she doesn't really know how to feel completely yet. But in this version, I feel like she's just really mean. Like, I didn't even bother mentioning this because I thought it would take too long to explain it. But in the script, like, she bakes him a plate of cookies, and then when he explains the story to her, he goes to take a cookie, she takes the plate of cookies away and throws them in the garbage, then breaks the plate and tells Peter to get out of her house. Like, I'm sorry, but can any of you imagine Rosemary Harris saying that? Can any of you imagine that happening? No? Well, good, because I can't imagine that happening either. Unless there's some unknown version out there I know where Aunt May is really mean to Peter, because I think that that's overly mean. Like, you know, and later on, to her credit, she does apologize, but she can't help being snarky about it. Like, when she goes to Peter's apartment to say she's sorry for not coming to him sooner, she's like, oh, it was wrong of me not to come to you sooner, but it was also wrong of you not to come to me sooner. Like, she can't help but just be a little bit snarky. And that's not Aunt May. That's not the Aunt May we saw in Spider-Man 1, and that's definitely not the Aunt May I would have wanted in Spider-Man 2. I'm more than happy with the one we got in Spider-Man 2, thank you very much. And then there's Doc Ock being youngified, which, I don't think it works as well. I understand why Sam Raimi ultimately shot it down, because I don't think it works as well. I do think it works better with the student-mentor dynamic. You know, and then there's a bunch of other stuff that they cut out. I wish they hadn't from this version. Like, Peter doesn't go to college, and like even to the point of some of the scenes being rearranged. Like, in this version, as I said, it starts off with the scene at the Daily Bugle, and then goes to the pizzeria scene where he's late and gets fired. And in the actual movie, they did it the other way around, and I think it worked a lot better that way, because you start off with a fun action scene, and then you do the slightly more boring scene in the Daily Bugle. Not that J. Jonah Jameson is boring, but like, it's not an action scene. And I think Spider-Man movies starting off with action scenes, you know, they immediately feel a little bit cooler. You know what I mean? Not to mention, it takes us somewhere we haven't seen before, and it kind of gives us a feeling of what we're in for the rest of the story. And to start off with the Daily Bugle, I think we just feel a little bit too samey, if that makes sense. So yeah, like, even to the point of scenes being switched around, I think that the one we ended up with was a lot better than this one, personally anyway. So yeah, I don't care for this one at all. I don't like that Doc Ock is younger. I don't like that he's a romantic rival for, you know, MJ. I don't like that Harry is, you know, overly, like, paranoid and mean to everybody. I don't like that that Aunt May is really mean. I don't like that Peter is so eager to give up being Spider-Man, because that's just not who he is, in my opinion. So yeah, I really don't care for this version. There are elements of it that are good, and those elements made it into the final movie, and that's why he got credited, because about a third of his script actually made it into the movie, from what I've heard, and you guys can probably tell from the video. But personally, I just don't care for this version. But let me know in the comments down below what you think of Michael Chabon's version of Spider-Man 2. Would you have somehow preferred this version to the actual one? Or would you have preferred, like me, the one we got in real life? Let me know all about it in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with all of your friends and all your various social media platforms. And speaking of social media, don't forget to follow me on Instagram, Rinzler_Productions, and I'll see all of you tomorrow in the next video.